Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, C.L. Max Nikias.
Good evening, everyone. I am pleased to welcome all of you to this inaugural conference of the USC US-China Institute. On behalf of the entire Trojan family, we are delighted that you could be a part of this great occasion. Those who have examined the history of Western higher education have recognized a steady and gradual shift at great universities, from being independent towers of study to being more engaged in the issues of their day. Given the enormous pace of social change in our day, great universities do not serve their students or their faculty by isolating them from their larger society. Nor do we serve our larger society by doing so. We bear a greater responsibility than before to be engaged in our world, so that we can help guide the many new forces that shape our lives in a manner that is consistent with humanity's deepest values. President Samble and USC's Board of Trustees made a commitment several years ago to making USC the model for a research university that serves our society through our academic programs and through our public service. Our USC US-China Institute represents a proud chapter in this effort. The Institute is a catalyst for new academic programs for our students and our faculty. And its approach is collaborative and creative, involving political scientists, global health specialists, economists, business school professors, public policy experts, law professors, and more. In this moment in history, it is essential for our universities such as USC to do more than examine events of the past. This institute is a forward-looking one which will shape political and economic and societal developments. I would like to thank Clay Dubie for providing outstanding leadership and energy during this crucial first year of the Institute's existence. Where is Clay? Can you please stand up? There he is. The Institute's faculty and staff have already accomplished a great deal. This evening's keynote address by Ambassador Roy represents the inaugural campus lecture for the Herbert G. Klein Lecture Series. As President Samble noted this morning, Mr. Klein is our distinguished USC alum and trustee. He served as President Nixon's communications director. Mr. Klein first visited China with President Nixon in 1972, and most recently participated in the delegation of USC trustees who toured China last spring. The Herbert G. Klein Lecture in Civic and Community Leadership at USC was established in May of 2006 through the USC College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. The lecture was created in response to the interest of many USC alumni and parents from the San Diego area. So now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our lecturer, Ambassador J. Stapleton Roy. This is a special moment for the Institute and for USC, and we're truly honored to have Ambassador Roy with us. His career is distinguished and storied, and his knowledge of Asian affairs is unmatched. Ambassador Roy retired from the United States Foreign Service after a remarkable 45-year career, having risen to the service's highest rank, Career Ambassador. Mr. Roy's parents were American missionaries to China. He was born in China and grew up there. He was a teenager there when the communists came to power. Mr. Roy is fluent in Chinese. He later graduated from Princeton University, where he majored in history and was elected in Phi Beta Kappa. As a diplomat, Mr. Roy served in Moscow at the height of the Cold War. His assignments also included Bangkok, Hong Kong, and Taipei. When the United States and China restored relations in 1979, Mr. Roy was appointed Deputy Chief of Mission. He later returned to Beijing as ambassador and served from 1991 to 1995. He was also ambassador to Singapore from 1984 to 1986 and to Indonesia from 1996 to 1999. At the time of his retirement in 2001, Mr. Roy was Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Research. Since then, he has been Managing Director of Kissinger Associates, a strategic consulting firm. We're truly delighted to have Ambassador Roy with us this evening. His relationship with China has been lifelong, both personally and professionally, and he is an individual of tremendous intellect and integrity. Please join me in welcoming tonight's Herbert G. Klein Lecturer, the Honorable Ambassador Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Provost, for those kind remarks. Mr. Klein, Mr. Tappan, friends. This is an unusual experience for me. I can't see anybody out there, so I just assume you are here. I am truly grateful to the University of Southern California and to this institute for giving me this opportunity to come to sunny California. On the one weekend when it's been above freezing in Washington, D.C. It really is a pleasure to be here, however, especially since I understand this is the first academic conference of the U.S.-China Institute. In a sense, then, I'm a fish out of water, because I come from a family of university professors, and I was the one member of the family that didn't qualify in any fashion for that distinguished position. So I had to jump into the sea and make my own way. So it's a pleasure to be back here, again, even if it is through the back door. The cliche of the moment is that the global center of gravity is shifting from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And in this case, the cliche is true. The interesting thing about it is that this process is being driven by economics and not by military conquest. The most advanced countries of the world have democratic systems and market economies, democratic political systems. The strength of these systems lies in the productive power of their economies and in their capacity to change leaders peacefully and thus to change policies as needed. But these same systems are predisposed by their electoral calendars to focus on immediate problems. As a result, and I'm not the only one to say this, they lack the capacity for long-range planning. This results in a tendency to focus on the urgent at the expense of the important. A rising power such as China, in contrast, has an authoritarian political system and an emerging market economy. China's political system inherently has less flexibility than our own. When saddled with bad leaders and bad policies, China has had difficulty changing course, as was demonstrated by the 11 long, troubled years of the Cultural Revolution. But under capable and competent leaders, as at present, China has demonstrated the capacity to develop and pursue long-range goals. Its economic performance has raised more people from poverty faster than ever seen before in history. In a sense, then, we are witnessing a high-stakes competition between two different approaches to governance, between a wealthy, powerful, and self-indulgent United States, whose principal articulated long-range goal is to remain the sole superpower for as long as possible, and a rising, determined, and focused China that has set for itself the ambitious goal of raising the living standard of its people to European levels within another 25 years. How this competition plays itself out will determine to an important degree the future of the world. This competition poses many questions, most of which are unanswerable at the moment. Can the United States preserve its wealth if it relies principally on power to accomplish its ends? Can China adhere to its declared policy of peaceful development as its power increases? Or will it succumb, as most other countries have done, to the temptations of nationalism and national aggrandizement? Can this competition be kept peaceful, or will it lead inevitably to military conflict? How will China change if it is successful in continuing to raise the living standard of its people under conditions of openness to the outside world? Indulging in cavalier assumptions on these questions would be dangerous. Just in the last 25 years, we have seen the rise of China, the reunification of Germany, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the prolonged stagnation of the Japanese economy. None of these developments was anticipated. All of them required us to alter our assumptions about the global system. The challenge, then, I would say, is not to predict the future, but to be prepared for it. And I think that's one of the reasons why the formation of this institute is so important. What do we know about China? The main focus has been on the incredible record of growth that it has established over the last 25 years. If you lived in China in the 1970s, you will appreciate the remarkable openness that now characterizes the country as opposed to the period 30 years ago. Hundreds of thousands of China's best and brightest have studied in the West and particularly in the United States. Western-educated Chinese now occupy significant positions in government, in business, and in education, and you find them everywhere in China. This has fundamentally altered the way the regime and the people of China look on the world. In essence, we need to be prepared for the possibility that within the next 25 years, China will have the second largest economy in the world, significantly expanded military capabilities, and influence in East Asia and the world that is unprecedented in modern times. This is not an idle proposition. Here are some of the relevant considerations drawn in part from an article by Nicholas Lardy, who is a leading expert on China's economic development. China's economy today is 10 times larger than it was in 1978. It's continuing to grow at roughly 10% a year, and I think, as you know, it's been exceeding that over the last few years, despite efforts to slow it down. To give you a base point for comparison, during that same 25-year period, the total growth in Latin America was 10%. China's growing at 10% a year. This has produced a number of not entirely surprising results. First, you have a sizable middle class in China that has emerged in the coastal provinces that have experienced the most rapid growth. This new middle class enjoys a level of affluence that was unthinkable in the 1970s, and it numbers in the hundreds of millions, even though this still represents a relatively small percentage of China's vast population. This is significant in thinking about the future of China, because middle classes are the necessary but not sufficient requirement for sustainable democratic transitions. The other side of the coin, and the coin of rapid growth is the one that gets the most attention in this country, but the coin has another side, and it's the alarming degree of inequality in China that has emerged over the last 25 years. It's reflected in a growing gap between incomes in cities and in the countryside, between the coastal areas and the interior, and between skilled labor and unskilled labor. When the reform period began in 1978, indices of inequality in China were extremely good. Inequality was low in China in comparison with India and with the countries of East and Southeast Asia. Now China's inequality indices show that it's on a par with India and with certain Latin American countries that are known for their unequal economic distribution, income distribution. Third, China's dependence on the outside world has grown immensely. At the beginning of the reform period, China was the 30th largest global trader. It is now number 3. China will overtake the United States this year as the world's largest exporter. It's projected to become the world's second largest trading country before the end of the decade. The cumulative figures for foreign direct investment in China over this period total about $650 billion, vastly more than have gone to any other developing country. Obviously, what China's system of government will be like if it is able to sustain rapid growth for another quarter century is vitally important. It's a vitally important consideration in thinking about China's future. In a recent book called The China Fantasy, a very knowledgeable reporter who lived and reported on China for a number of years argues that China can continue economic growth for another 3 decades and in the process become a richer and more powerful country, but that it can also remain a repressive, one-party state run by a Leninist regime. Such negative assumptions are already affecting attitudes toward China in this country. I do not think that is an accurate or likely scenario, but the proposition is not one you can brush aside. It has to be looked at and analyzed carefully in order, as I mentioned earlier, to be sure that we are not surprised about what takes place down the road. We also need to be mentally prepared for the possibility that China will stumble badly at some point over the next 2.5 decades. We need only recall how wrong assumptions about Japan were at the end of the 1980s. China's modernization is entering a new and potentially much more difficult stage. During the first 25 years, the focus was on growth, harnessing market forces to drive the economy, and dismantling the state enterprise system. Now the principal challenges facing the government are social justice issues. Disparities of income are fueling dissatisfaction. The weakening of the public health and primary education systems and the absence of a fully developed or functioning social security system are affecting the people's sense of well-being and security. According to some estimates, 70% of urban dwellers lack adequate access to medical care, and the figure in rural areas may be as high as 90%. These problems are being exacerbated by an excessive rate of economic growth, and I would note that the government has been unable to slow down the economy despite efforts over the last 4 years. The growing power of the provinces is also a problem, especially in the wealthy coastal areas whose prosperity makes them less dependent on handouts from Beijing. There is also widespread corruption, which has affected the lives of all Chinese. Aside from these factors, China's continued rapid growth is likely to encounter mounting obstacles, such as energy shortages, such as pressure on global resources driving up the costs of the basic inputs for development. Environmental impact of rapid growth is destroying China's eco-environment. A major portion of the most heavily polluted cities in the world are located in China, and the public health consequences for the Chinese people are growing and becoming a significant burden on the country. The problem will get worse if China is required, as it will be required, to rely primarily on coal-fired power stations as a way of meeting its energy needs. Strains produced by movement from traditional regional economies to a national economic system will increase. There will be social unrest and stability issues, and there will be the potential diversion of resources to military spending. These are enormous problems for the government to deal with. The international environment is also becoming more troubled from the standpoint of planning China's future development. China's growing economic strength and military power are shifting the context of thinking about China in countries such as the United States and Japan. This has happened much faster than China's leaders anticipated. China's preoccupation with maintaining stability is leading to a tightening of domestic controls, which is viewed in this country as repression, and this has created difficulties for major U.S. companies operating in China who are subject to domestic criticism because of their investments there. China's rapid growth is also fueling an assertive form of nationalism in Japan that until last fall had severely damaged Japan's relations with its two neighbors in Northeast Asia, South Korea and China. These problems are formidable, but for the moment they appear manageable. The reasons? Are several. China's leaders are experienced, competent, and appear to be cohesive. They are focused on addressing the key problem areas. You saw this clearly at the National People's Congress session that just took place in March. China is not fantasizing about what its problems are. It is identifying them, and it is coming up with government policies to address those problems. And that includes all of these social justice issues that I have just mentioned. Because leaders have been focused on the right issues, and this applies largely to the last 25 years, they have established an enviable track record of keeping instability factors from disrupting economic growth. Moreover, despite our own worries about China, the Bush administration has discovered the same thing that previous U.S. administrations have discovered. They need cooperation with China to address global issues that are important to the United States. Terrorism, non-proliferation, North Korea and Iran, key examples. Iraq, where China has been more helpful in working with us, even though it does not support our policy, but it has not openly opposed it in the way that the French and the Germans and the Russians have done. Whether China succeeds or fails over the next quarter century takes on special significance when we consider that the legitimacy of the one-party system in China essentially rests on economic performance. Take away economic performance, and the possibility of systemic collapse could rise to an alarming level. I was a U.S. ambassador in Indonesia during the Asian financial crisis. You had just had an election under which President Suharto was reelected. His legitimacy collapsed when Indonesian economic performance dropped. The same thing could happen in China, and a crisis of this magnitude in a country with nearly a quarter of the world's population would pose challenges greater than we have seen in the post-World War II period. Let me pause for a moment to deal with this question of scale, because I find that Americans may pay lip service to it, but they don't understand it. Most Americans I have found have difficulty conceptualizing the problems of running a country with 4 times the population of the United States, which is adding people at the rate of 11 million people per year, meaning you get a population the size of the United States every 25 years or so. Think of the jobs, the health care, the education, the housing, the clothing needs that you encounter under those circumstances. Let's look at some specific examples. China has over 30 provincial level units. 3 Chinese populations have populations larger than Germany, which is the largest country in Europe west of Russia. Any 2 of these 3 provinces together has a population larger than that of Russia. China's top 4 provinces together have a population larger than the United States. If California, which I think some of you may know is our most populous state, were in China, it would rank 17th in terms of population, coming just after Guizhou. Texas, our second most populous state, would rank 24th, and New York would come in near the bottom, just ahead of Xinjiang. Remember that in area, China and the United States are just about the same. But China has 3% less land suitable for cultivation. So imagine what our lifestyle in the United States all the problems of pollution, clean water, social harmony, etc., that this would bring. I find Americans simply don't understand this. They think that we can prescribe how China should address its problems with no understanding of the circumstances that China itself faces. If we were to take the U.S. political system and plunk it down in China and keep the same 435 members of our House of Representatives, each electoral district would be the size of the population of Singapore. But Singapore has 94 representatives in its parliament, representing a constituency of that size. If we instead kept the same size as our current electoral districts, you would end up with a Congress with 2,100 members. Think of the amount of pork that would generate in a single year. So if we were to sit down and try to devise a representative system of government for China, we would immediately run into the problem of scale. Now, of course, India, with a population that's rapidly approaching that of China, does have a democratic system of government. So in theory, this is possible. But if you sit down and actually try to wrap your mind around the question of how would you get a system of representative government in China, it's not so simple. And that suggests that perhaps we shouldn't rush to judgment in terms of how the process of political reform, which is necessary in China, should take place and at what speed. Given these factors, it's not hard to understand why China poses such fundamental issues for our global system in general and for the United States in particular. The first is, how do we manage the growing resource needs and environmental impact of a rapidly developing China within a global community? The second is, how do we assess and respond to China's growing military capabilities, which are an inevitable part of a country that has a larger economic pie with which to fund its military needs? The third is, how do we deal with the economic consequences of China's rise in terms of their impact on jobs, investment flows, and trade balances, a big political issue in the United States? And the fourth is, what is the impact on U.S. foreign policy interests going to be of a country like China that has growing influence in East Asia and in international councils? I'll only briefly touch on the resource issue, but it's one we should keep in mind. The Asian economic miracle, you will recall, was caused by the rapid growth rates of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, entities that together have a collective population less than 200 million. But China has been growing at an equal or greater rate for 25 years with a population that is 6 times to 7 times the population of the Asian tigers in Japan that established the East Asian Miracle. In addition, India, with a population of nearly over a billion people now, is growing at rapid rates now. So imagine the implications for global resources. Some of these implications were addressed in an article by Les Brown in the London Times last year. He noted that China has now overtaken the United States as the leading resource consumer. Among the basic commodities, China consumes more grain and meat, more coal, more steel than the United States. If China were to reach the U.S. level of development, it would have 1.1 billion cars, compared to 800 million cars in the world today. To provide roads and parking for these vehicles, it would have to pave an area equal to the area now under rice cultivation in China. It would use 99 million barrels of oil per day, as compared with the current global consumption of 84 million barrels. Finally, I've left India out of the equation. If India continues to grow, you can see the implications of having populations of this size rise to our levels of development in terms of the pressure on global resources. Now, this poses some stark choices, which, frankly, I do not hear discussed here in the United States. Should we seek to hold back the growth of countries like China and India so that we can maintain our own standards of living and not have to conserve the resources that we use? Or should we seek a cooperative approach aimed at accommodating these needs through mechanisms that provide for a fair allocation of these resources? In other words, should the United States conserve energy so that China and India can grow? Politically, that might be a non-starter. But intellectually, it's not a non-starter. It's an issue that has to be addressed, and our political leaders will either address it or choose not to address it. But if they had a long-range planning focus, they would find that this was a front and center issue. If we were to adopt the former approach, namely of trying to restrain the resources available to the developing world so that we could continue an unrestrained use of resources on our own part, what would this mean in terms of the values which are so important to our system of government? These are genuine issues, and they are more focused on in other countries than they are in the United States. They're affecting our foreign policy interests because many Chinese and Indians have already come to the conclusion that our policy is to hold down their economic development. In many cases, they interpret our environmental policies and our human rights policies as cynical efforts to slow their rate of growth. Now, that's false. But they don't see us focused on the need to share global resources in a fair way, and therefore they put invidious interpretations on policies that we pursue for other reasons. Turning to military factors. As China grows stronger, we also see an emerging tendency to view a more powerful and prosperous China as a security threat. Two aspects of China's growing military strength should be of concern to the United States, as the most recent defense report on PRC military power makes clear. First, Chinese military modernization is accelerating, and secondly, the Chinese military is preparing for conflict contingencies in the Taiwan Strait that include possible U.S. intervention. In other words, the Chinese military is preparing for possible conflict scenarios with the United States. This is not something we can ignore. But the heart of the challenge lies in the fact that China is the one country in the world today that has the potential to be a challenger to our status as the sole superpower. The significance of this growing military power, of course, depends to a significant degree on how we assess prospects for maintaining a constructive and cooperative relationship with China. If we make pessimistic assumptions that China is going to end up being a hostile power, that will be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if we make naive assumptions that it won't become a hostile power, that could be dangerous. So we need to think and assess this issue carefully. But when I see discussions of China's military spending, what I notice is the total absence of context for thinking seriously about this issue. First, there's no historical context to provide a basis for understanding how China's military planners think about their own security requirements. They, for example, have to take into account the fact that over the last 70 years, China has been in military conflict with Japan, the United States, India, Russia, and Vietnam. How many Americans can pull those countries out of the hat and understand that for China, this is recent history, but for us, it's past history and therefore not relevant? Second, there's an absence of discussion about the external considerations that affect China's determination of what kind of military capabilities it needs, other than occasional references to the Taiwan Strait. These considerations include the demonstrated prowess of U.S. military technology in 2 wars in the Gulf. There's not a single military establishment in the world that has not decided it needed to modernize its military technology, because we have demonstrated conclusively that if you don't have modern military technology, you're a sitting duck for the U.S. military. And secondly, we're deploying a national missile defense system that has a potential impact on China's strategic deterrent. So you can see there are 3 factors that lie behind Chinese thinking about its military needs. It needs modernization, it needs to strengthen its capabilities in the Taiwan Strait, and it needs to deal with actions that we are taking that potentially erode its own military capabilities. I'm not justifying what China does. I'm simply saying that you can't discuss what China is doing if you don't bring these considerations into play. Third, one rarely sees any effort to calculate what China's military budget ought to be. If you don't say what China's military budget ought to be, you cannot say that China is spending too much. Too much more than what? I've never seen it. We just leave that out there. And yet our top government officials go around saying China's spending too much on the military. From an intellectual standpoint, this is a university environment, so I'm giving an intellectual presentation on this question. You cannot ignore the question of how much is enough. China has enormous borders to defend and a giant population. So, the discussions I have seen also don't say what anybody else is doing on defense. And yet, obviously, China's defense spending is partly affected by what other countries are doing. If one consults the CIA World Factbook, which does not incidentally estimate China's defense budget at the level that China itself says it is, but provides a much higher figure as an unclassified estimate of its defense spending. But we find then that China's defense spending is only 1/3 more than Japan's. But China has a population 10 times larger than Japan's. It's got 9,000 coastal miles to defend and about 14,000 miles land borders to defend, and a population of 1.3 billion. And Japan's defense is dependent ultimately on the United States. So if you look at it from that standpoint, is China spending enough compared to Japan? I don't know the answer. I'm simply saying if you want to intellectually think about these questions, you have to look at it. If we look at Europe, we find that the big four in Europe, Germany, France, the UK, and Italy, they spend twice as much together on defense as China does. But we say Europe doesn't spend enough on defense, and we say China spends too much. And yet Europe, you could argue, for the moment, fits an example of an entity that doesn't really have serious external threats. And finally, I see all the time presumptions that turn China's strategic planners into idiots. Let me explain what I'm talking about. Here is a country that through hard work has essentially lifted itself from poverty to a level that is still far below that of even the weakest European country. And yet this country, after a few more years of continued growth, is going to want to throw it all away by getting into a confrontation with the global military titans like ourselves. Do you think that China's leaders really think that way? Are they developing the country so it can all be destroyed by obstreperous foreign policies? When I meet with China's leaders, I get exactly the opposite impression. But when I read U.S. newspapers, one has the sense that China is aching for a confrontation with other countries. People quote Defense Department studies that say that China's need for energy means it's going to become an aggressive expansionist power, meaning that China, with its ignorance of history, is going to pursue the course of Japan and Germany without regard to the consequences that resulted for those countries. When I talk to the Chinese, I find that they have paid attention to those examples, and they don't intend to follow them. So again, this is disturbing, not because we shouldn't be concerned about growing Chinese defense spending. We should be concerned. But we have to be intelligent in thinking about it, and I find that we are not provided with the context we need to engage in intelligent discussion on these types of questions. Now, the economic factors I think we're all familiar with. We had a panic 2 years ago when the Chinese were moving in to purchase Unocal, and it produced what was called a fever pitch of concern in Congress. Claims were made that if the purchase were approved, it would damage U.S. national security and compromise our energy future. The Washington Times cited a Pentagon study, this is the one I just mentioned, that China's need for energy is driving China toward becoming an expansionist power, and it could lead to its use of military force to seize territory with oil and gas reserves. The U.S. government, during the height of this crisis, said nothing. When the crisis was over, the administration put out a statement essentially saying that there was no problem for the United States if the Chinese wanted to acquire foreign assets. After all, the United States constantly buys foreign assets in other countries. A more serious issue are the claims that China is stealing American jobs, that its currency is manipulated and undervalued, and thus artificially contributing to our trade deficit, and that China is not living up to its commitments to protect intellectual property, and thus is inflicting billions of dollars of damage on American companies. Some of these allegations are true. They're all difficult to deal with in a political environment. The Chicago Council on Foreign Relations conducted a poll 2 years ago in which they asked ordinary Americans what the top priority should be for American foreign policy. 78% said that protecting the jobs of American workers was the top foreign policy priority. Now, this poll was divided into ordinary Americans and so-called leading Americans. For leading Americans, that wasn't on the charts. For ordinary Americans, protecting jobs was what our foreign policy was all about. It was more important for them than preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, from combating international terrorism, or all of the traditional foreign policy goals that we pursue. Only 32% of the public thought that protecting the interests of American business abroad should be an important goal. Now that illustrates the political problem, and it's a real problem. If the American public thinks that our jobs are being stolen and that our foreign policy should be aimed at protecting those jobs, then dealing with China is a troublesome question. Now, mind you, over the last 3 years, we've heard a lot of cries about American jobs needing protection, and this is under conditions of full employment. Imagine what the situation would be if we had 10% unemployment and the same charges were made. It would become a much more volatile political issue, and you can imagine how this could potentially impact on our relations with China. This brings us to this question of how we manage the bilateral relationship. The administration is hard-pressed to deal with the pressures from Congress right now on a whole range of these types of economic issues. If you read your newspapers, you recognize that we've just put punitive tariffs on certain types of Chinese paper products, and we've just taken 2 cases to the World Trade Organization on market access and on intellectual property protection. I was just in Beijing and met with Vice Premier Wu Yi, who some of you may be familiar with. She was China's top trade negotiator, and she had some very pithy things to say about the U.S. actions, but the U.S. actions were undoubtedly necessary for the administration to keep the initiative in its own hands when a Congress is eager to come up with bills that would have been much worse from the standpoint of China. So managing these factors is difficult. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that the way that China's economic growth is impacting on Americans is not fairly presented in much of our public discussion. If we analyze the figures, we find, for example, that our trade deficit has almost nothing to do with China's currency. You can find an almost exact equivalence between the increase in China's trade deficit with us and the decrease in the trade deficit of other key East Asian trading partners as they have moved their manufacturing facilities over to China. So in other words, as Taiwan moves its soft shoe industry to Guangdong, China gets the trade deficit, Taiwan companies get the profits. So this is the type of trend that is largely responsible for our trade deficit. That does not mean that China's currency is fairly valued. It merely means that the value of the currency is not the driving factor in the size of our trade deficit with China. China, as many people have noted, is our fastest growing export market. Our exports to China have been growing faster than to any other significant market in the world. A study a year ago looked at the implications for the U.S. economy of China's trade and investment with the United States over the 10-year period from 2001 to the end of the decade. They found that our GDP would be about 0.7% higher per year as a result of that trade and investment, and that our prices would be about 0.8% lower during that period, resulting in approximately $1,000 in the pockets of every American household every year over the course of that 10 years. In other words, Americans are benefiting from our trade and investment with China. We're not being damaged. We're benefiting through lower prices, and we're benefiting through GDP growth because our companies cannot maintain their international competitiveness if they don't take advantage of the opportunities in China. So, how do we weave these factors together in managing the China relationship? These are the challenges that any administration faces in Washington. But we also have to consider the question of how China's growing influence is impacting on our foreign policy. If the U.S. goal is to maintain unchallengeable supremacy, and it has been defined in those terms, then there's some inevitable consequences. If our goal is to remain the world's sole superpower, the first consequence is no other country shares that objective, meaning we have defined a foreign policy which we cannot get common interests with other countries in support of. Successful foreign policies are based on finding common interests with other countries. So we need to be careful how we define our goals in the world. But there's a second problem. If our goal is perpetual supremacy, China's rise inevitably is going to become threatening. And that means sooner or later we have to pursue a policy of containment against China, and whether that will be a good or a bad foreign policy will partly depend on how other countries are reacting to China's rise. If it isolates us in the world, it will not be a good situation to be in. If China is acting in an obstreperous manner and needs containment, then we need to be confident that we have allies willing to work with us under those circumstances. If, on the other hand, the U.S. goal is to ensure the prosperity and security of the American people, then you have a different set of conclusions. First, it would signal U.S. acceptance of a world in which other countries have an equal right to pursue the well-being and security of their people, as long as they do so peacefully and not through force and conquest. In this case, the United States does not need to be threatened by a stronger and more prosperous China that behaves responsibly, in which case the goal of our foreign policy is not containment, but rather to maximize prospects for China behaving in a responsible manner in the world. So you can see that we can define our foreign policy goals in ways that almost inevitably create confrontation with China, or we can define them in ways that indicates that a cooperative relationship with China will be the most effective way of pursuing our interests down the road. So these are not trivial considerations, because we need to pay attention to how China is defining its foreign policy goals, and we can be equally certain that China will pay attention to the manner in which we define our own foreign policy. I've been running on too long. I will not walk you through all of the consequences for East Asia that are flowing from this, but let me summarize quickly by saying that we see two trends in Asia right now. The first is a desire for collective mechanisms to help balance the rise of China. And the second is a desire for collective mechanisms that help to balance the United States. Other countries do not like a situation where there's a sole superpower. We see it in Russia and China getting closer together and talking about strategic partnership. We talk about our own strategic partnership with India, but guess what? India and China have been getting closer together and are talking about strategic partnership. So we would be making a big mistake if we think that China is the only problem in the world. In fact, most of our friends and allies and other significant countries are all maneuvering to try to ensure that their interests can be defended properly under circumstances where you have a big, strong United States and a growing China that could behave either responsibly or irresponsibly, depending on the circumstances. The United States has not been well positioned to engage in this community building process, in part because our attention has been on the Middle East, and in part because we have simply not made the concept of community building an important part of our foreign policy thinking. We still have a tendency to think about our security interests in East Asia in terms of our security treaties with Japan and Korea. But the reality is that those treaties have been moving in different directions. South Korea has been finding more common interests with China, and particularly under circumstances of friction between Japan and China, Japan has been interested in strengthening the U.S. Security relationship. So this holds the potential, if not handled skillfully, of bifurcating Northeast Asia into a South Korea-China versus a U.S. and Japan combination. And that's not in our interest, because we have important interests with China, just as we have important interests with Japan. And we don't want a situation where you would have to choose between them if we are pursuing a skillful policy. In a sense, then, we face a strategic gamble down the road. If we hope to see a democratic evolution in China, we have to hope for the continued success of China's economic development. In Asia, there is an unbroken record of countries, authoritarian countries, that have persisted in economic growth for 4 decades while maintaining openness to the outside world and participating actively in the global economic system. They have all moved to representative forms of government, no exception. South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, Indonesia. Thailand shows the process perhaps can backslide. But the fact is, East Asia is an absolute model. If you want democratic development, you need economic development. And you need openness, and you need participation in economies. China meets all of those criteria. Does that mean it will happen? The answer is no. A lot of other things could happen. Is it likely to happen? Play the odds. It's happened everywhere else. We're in one of those rare historical moments when every modern country in the world has a democratic system of government and a market economy. China's goal is modernization. That means it is looking to the modern countries of the world to provide it with the education, the technology, and the know-how in order to modernize itself. All of those outside influences come from countries with democratic systems and market economies. Why should we be pessimistic about the trends that will emerge in China if it is able to continue economic development down the road? And don't forget, the next generation of Chinese leaders, the fifth generation leaders, will be the first generation that will have risen to political maturity under conditions of education and exposure heavily to the outside world. Our problem is we want instant political reform and instant movement away from authoritarian political structures. And from a value standpoint, I can understand that. From a realistic standpoint, it's not the way we developed, and it's not the way other countries develop. So we needed a little historical patience, if you will, and that's where the big gamble comes in. Because if you want China to democratize, it needs to continue economic growth, and that will make it stronger and more powerful. And so there's where the test runs. What the debate about China illustrates is that much of the time we can't even agree on the nature of the country we're talking about. We see in China what we choose to, and the debate is often more emotional than rational. I remember reading an article in the New York Times a few decades ago which said, "The American public does not cope easily with the People's Republic of China. It's largely the fault of the missionaries, businessmen, diplomats, and intellectuals who have over the years shaped our images to serve their own or their patrons' purposes." I assume that's what the purpose of this conference was. We have diplomats, we have intellectuals, I'm a missionary son, so there you have it. It brings to mind that astute Asian specialist, Lamont Cranston, perhaps better known to some of you of proper age as the Shadow, who while traveling in the Orient had learned the secret of clouding men's minds. There's no doubt that he learned that secret in China, because China seems to have an unsurpassed capacity to cloud our minds. Unfortunately, issues with regard to China are broader than simply staving off evildoers in New York City, which was the goal of the Shadow. They involve the global balance of power, U.S. interests in East Asia, questions of war and peace, and arguably the health of the U.S. economy. That's why the U.S.-China Relations Research Institute is so important. Hopefully, it will help to uncloud our minds. I wish you every success. Okay.
Do you have questions? Of course there are questions. And if you could wait until we get a microphone to you, and please identify yourself before raising the question.
Thank you, Clay. Dick Drobnik from the USC Marshall School of Business. Stape, thank you for coming back. It's wonderful to have you back here. You opened your remarks with the statement about different time horizons. The U.S. government planners, the Congress, the political dynamic versus the Chinese. You also said the Chinese are very well trained and very smart also. If you're an advisor to the next president, how would you focus them in one or two ways, him or her, into developing a more robust strategy towards China? And also, if you're an advisor to the current or the next chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, given how much of our securities the Chinese buy, what would you be advising them to think about?
That's a big question. It's all very well to talk about needing a longer horizon, but our political system is not structured to make it realistic to put your emphasis entirely on the longer range goal. But the one area where I think that we do need a longer term policy is the United States now has the power to intervene anywhere in the world because there is no power strong enough to stand up to us. We would not be in Iraq if the Soviet Union had not collapsed, because the war would have been too costly if the Soviets had been in a position to fund the other side and to provide them with military equipment. But with the United States, it has not addressed the question of needing to know more about a world in which we have the capability to use our power unopposed. And what we found in Iraq when we went in is we didn't know enough about the country, and we encountered problems that we hadn't anticipated because of our lack of knowledge. If you were familiar with China 25 years ago, the Chinese were appallingly bad at understanding us because they had no experience in dealing with us. But they have flooded us with students, many of whom were government officials or became government officials. They're in all of their universities. And now the Chinese embassy in Washington is one of the most astute embassies in understanding how our political system works. And when you talk to Chinese American specialists, they are highly knowledgeable about how the United States operates. I don't think our understanding of China has improved. It was already pretty good. We were much better than the Chinese 25 years ago. We're still pretty good, but the Chinese are better. And they've done it over 25 years. It seems to me an intolerable situation for the United States to complacently assume that we can be a sole superpower while we remain an ignoramus, by and large, about the world. I just read an article in the newspaper the other day which talked about the shocking number of adult Americans who can't find Iraq or Afghanistan on the map. Some of them can't find the United Kingdom on the map. Something like 35% couldn't find the Pacific Ocean on the map. So my advice to the president was, this country cannot deserve to be a sole superpower, and I like the situation where the United States is the preeminent country in the world. I'd rather have it us than anybody else, but I want us to do it well. So that would be the first question. The second issue would be the question of shorter-term foreign policy. And there, I think the main requirement for the United States is to try to create an international structure which supports stability and prosperity and doesn't put it on individual countries to try to carry out these functions. It doesn't matter whether it's the United Nations or some other way of going about it, but you need a better structured international system, and 15 years into the post-Cold War world, the United States, in my judgment, has not addressed this question. In fact, we've almost become hostile to international organizational structures because we see them as potential constraints on our own freedom of action. So those are the two areas where I think in a generic sense we need to focus. One, a longer-term goal to improve our knowledge of the world, and that means we've got to flood the world with students. We need people who have lived abroad long enough so that they know the language and are comfortable living abroad. If we take Asian students coming here, the figure is usually 2 years. Those first 2 years are tough. They don't like the food, they have trouble adapting, they're homesick, but after 2 years, they're able to live here. That's that sign. It's getting that level of comfort in living in foreign societies that gives you the level of confidence that you know something about how other countries operate. So I really think we need to do a lot more in that area.
Merle Goldman.
Merle Goldman from Boston University and the Fairbanks Center at Harvard. I like what you say, and I like your optimistic scenario. But the people that I talk to in China, and they are people who are interested in human rights issues and political change in China, tell me that this present group of leaders, they're the best educated that China's had, certainly in terms of education, but they say they are more repressive today than the leadership was in the late 1990s. In other words, they said there was more space for political discourse in the late 1990s than there is today. So this kind of, I like your optimistic scenario, but it is not going to go in a straight line. And this leadership is interested certainly in dealing with the greater inequalities, but they're not open to other kinds of points of view, and they find them much more repressive.
The Communist Party of China is determined to maintain political control in China for the indefinite future. There's no question about that. To call it the Chinese Communist Party, however, is a wild misnomer. It is no more a communist party than the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is a democratic country because it styles it as such. And if you want, I can explain to you why they have essentially abandoned communism. It's built into the party's philosophy right now. The three represents means the Communist Party represents the advanced productive forces, which are capitalists, the advanced cultural forces, which are scientists and engineers, and the interests of all of the people. And the big issue is not class struggle, but creating a harmonious society. China is going through a process of rapid change, and the instability factors are high. The system is using repression to try to keep the instability factors under control. You're absolutely right. I do not find the climate of intellectual discourse in China significantly different. It opened up in the 80s. It has continued open compared to the past. There may be little gradations. I remember when China began to open up, they would periodically have little campaigns to stop speaking English to avoid spiritual pollution with people. And I can remember U.S. government officials coming to Beijing, and I'd take them out walking, you know, in the Temple of Heaven or someplace, and everybody would come up. Hello, are you, you know, from someone? He said, I thought there was a campaign against speaking English. There was. But life went on. People wanted to learn English, and they practiced it. So I think the mistake is in thinking that because this regime right now is not loosening the way that it maintains stability in China, that means it's not going to occur at some point down the road. As we know, the instability, the government itself, I think for its own reasons, is publicizing the level of discontent around the country. All these statistics about 80,000 demonstrations come from the Chinese media. So they're not suppressing it. I think they're using it to justify the program to develop the West. In a sense, it's a warning to the coastal provinces that you will have an unmanageable situation if we don't begin to address these social justice issues. So they're addressing the social justice issues, but they're also using repression to try to maintain the sole political power of the leading party. So one can't say that they are a democratizing force right now, but they are creating the conditions for eventual transition in that direction decades down the road.
Wang Hui from Beijing CSS again. Try not to be humble again. Nice to see you again. Yes, has been 15 years. Your speech tonight was really remarkable and very impressed by, especially for many Chinese people, from China. But many misperceptions from United States are for the domestic in China, but there's some misconception and many Chinese scholars and the students in United study or work in United States. Lots of media and maybe some government units, they have a lot of opinions on Chinese students. They treat many Chinese students, scholars, and businessmen are spies. Since you serve Assistant Director of CIA, what's your opinion on that? Thank you.
You've given me a new job. I was never in the CIA. I was the Director of Intelligence and Research in the State Department as my last job. It was part of the intelligence community, but it was not the Deputy Director of CIA. Your point, I'm not sure I captured your point. The question is, how well do we understand what's going on in China?
Lots of media and people in the United States treat Chinese scholars and students in the United States
As spies.
for Chinese government.
Ah, right. All countries, without exception, have a tendency to view foreign visitors, students, business people, journalists as spies. Some of them may be, most of them aren't. You could divide intelligence from spying. Spying means using special techniques to gain access to information that you shouldn't have access to. Intelligence means going to a country and gaining a better understanding of how that country functions. That's what our diplomatic establishments of every country are designed to do around the world. So in that sense, all Chinese in this country are intelligence agents in the sense that they are gaining a better understanding of how the United States functions. Does that make them spies? The answer is no. Have there been spies among them? The answer is yes. But China is not the only country that behaves this way, and one can cite how it happens. The purpose of the United States is to keep ourselves open to foreign visitors and to catch foreign spies. So if it's done properly, Chinese students do not have to feel that they are under any difficulty any more than any other foreign student. If it is not done well, then there will be difficulties for foreigners. And I think you know, in the post-9/11 atmosphere in the United States, certain people who look certain ways, not Chinese, but if you were from the Middle East or if you wear a turban, you have encountered all sorts of assumptions that you were a spy or a saboteur or a terrorist of some sorts. So this is how societies function. I think that in general, the United States is an open society, but there may be specific instances in which students encounter suspicions.
Mr. Maltz?
Yes, my name is Lawrence Maltz. I answer the microphone. All right. Thank you, Ambassador. I think your remarks are well taken, and I just wanted to mention something to this intellectual group about a different kind of experience in China. I had the pleasure of starting an American company in China, a consumer product company. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to understand that the aspirations of the young people that work at our company, work for our company and with our company in China, are absolutely identical to the aspirations of the young people that work in the United States. And while this may not seem, readily important, I think when we develop policies, governmental policies, and you alluded to the fact that China is not looking for a way to destroy their country, that we all get down on the ground a little bit and realize that the youth, including the new leaders of China, who will be relatively young, share the same aspirations as the young people, not only in the United States, but everywhere in the world. And so it's very instructive, I think, at least it was for me, having spent many, many years working with these people in China, to keep that in mind whenever we form opinions about China. And to remember that, you know, our goals are not different, but our goals, at least for that upcoming group of Chinese, are exactly the same as for the upcoming group in the United States.
I agree there's a lot to work with in China in terms of common aspirations. I think that in China, as in the United States, you will find some Chinese who define their goals in ways that we would not find a common interest with, and you will find that Chinese feel that there are some Americans who define our goals in ways that they cannot agree with. But certainly my experience in China over the years has been that we should not have difficulty in tapping in to a common sense of what we would like to accomplish.
Mr. Klein.
It seems to me that the meeting today, and first I'd like to compliment you on truly a great address. It was very informative. I think it balanced things, and I really appreciate you doing it. But it does seem to me that it's particularly appropriate to have it at a university, because it looks to me like research universities who can give us better education in terms of keeping ahead on developments in the world today, in the commercial world, really part of the key to the United States dealing properly with China and keeping ahead. I'd like your comment on that.
Let me be sure that I can articulate exactly. This is the role of research universities in trying to keep us ahead.
Yeah, compared to the Chinese.
I think the U.S. graduate educational program is the best in the world, without doubt, across the board. I do think, however, that China's educational system has been getting better rapidly, so we can't rest on our laurels. But I think that we do a superb job of creating this educational specialists that we need, certainly in our intellectual environment. I don't think as a country that we are meeting the challenge adequately. I think that we need a much broader, here's the way I would put it, and you certainly know Washington better than I do, Mr. Klein. If the American people don't care about the world, they will elect a Congress that doesn't care about the world. And then we have a problem in getting the support in Washington for the policies we need to pursue. So the way to get a Congress that is sophisticated in understanding how best the United States can play our role in the world, you have to have an American public that is capable of understanding those same issues. Democracies are a problem. The ordinary people elect our representatives, and if you don't have the ordinary people conscious of how the United States needs to behave in the world, then we're going to have a Congress that doesn't give us the support we need. So I think that's the area I'd like to see the focus. But as far as research institutes are concerned, and as far as our graduate educational programs are concerned, I think you do a terrific job. The one area I would say that I'm concerned about is the fact that in our sciences and technology areas, a heavy proportion of our graduate students are foreign students. When I go to China, and this has to do partly with their stage of development, but I think of the 9 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo in China, I think 8 of them are engineers and 1's a geologist. Wen Jiabao was trained in geology, although he also has an engineer status. If you go to Washington, it's hard to find anyone with a scientific engineering background in government. You find it elsewhere. So some people have tried to theorize about the question of whether, if you have a scientific background, are you more methodical in the way you analyze problems? I don't know. Maybe there's something useful there to be understood. But the fact is that China's leaders are largely trained engineers. There's a heavy proportion of them in the top levels of the party apparatus. And our people are all educated, but they're all educated in areas other than science and engineering generally.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know that there are probably dozens more questions. It's been a terrific day, and this was a wonderful lecture. The Herbert Klein Lecture here at USC, the first of them, and we're really delighted that we've had this opportunity to listen to Ambassador Roy, who has given us marching orders not just for USC and other research universities, but for a nation as a whole. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.